All right, we're recording. This is Service API's office hours for May 13, 2020. And thanks to Harry, he added something to the agenda to start off, and I think that's a good starting point. There's been lots of new PRs and changes and issues that have come up in the past little bit. So I think we'll have plenty to talk about. But I think this is a good starting point. Danian, I think you're on the call, right? Do you want to give a bit of background on this PR and what you're hoping to do here?
Yeah, let me take a look here. Ads request, retrain ads. Yeah, I think it's if you click on the issue number 58 there, it gives us some background, and I'll talk through it. So this, I believe this came from Knative community requirements. I actually see in support of Knative serving 6593 in the comment section below. So we see that Knative has a handful of capabilities that they would like service APIs to support, so they no longer need to maintain their ingress CR. So they ultimately want to adopt service APIs, and in order to do so, this is some of the post forwarding action traffic manipulation, right? Because the current flow that we have right now is, we match optionally. We can do some type of filtering, and then we take an action on the request. Most typical action is just to forward the request to a service. Well, before forwarding that request to a service, we need to be able to perform some type of manipulation. Other capabilities, such as being able to not just necessarily forward the request to a backend, but to actually start applying weights to certain backends, maybe mirroring the traffic to some other service. This is the issue that I tried to kind of capture a lot of those requirements. And going back to your question, Rob, the PR addresses, let's see, the request. So the ability to retry. So we go ahead and we forward, we attempt to create a connection to that backend, and we need some kind of timeouts, or do we want to be able to retry making that connection to the backend? And that's what this PR is attempting to do.
Great, thanks. And Harry, you had a couple of follow-up questions on this?
Yes, so that makes a lot of sense as to why these attributes should be in the core API. What I was wondering was the reason why Knative ingress and we are trying to add these is because there is nowhere in the service resource to actually do anything with these. So if you look at if you scroll up, the timeout policy and retry policy are included in the forward to target, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
Correct, yeah. So what my question is, should these be more about setting on a per service basis, or should these be for each and every target? So consider a scenario where you have multiple HTTP routes that are pointing to the same service. In that case, should these properties be on a per route basis, or do these properties belong to more of a service?
Yeah, that's kind of, I hope my audio is okay. Interesting enough, like for the way we have set it up for ingress on Google Cloud, these are more on a per service basis. It seems to have just shook out like that in our schema. So that's a good question. The other one is kind of how generic we are. We're saying these are core. Danian, have you checked to make sure we can make that requirement, I guess?
Yeah, I haven't checked every different implementation. I think I looked at H8 proxy and I looked at Contour. Did I look at anything else? I think those are probably the two that I looked at.
Yeah, if you have done the research, it would be good to kind of, I don't know where we would record it, because probably the cloud providers will have slightly different, although we know everyone is eventually going to converge. We just need to be careful that we don't go too far in terms of requiring it. If anything, maybe it could be extended.
Yeah.
Is there a
So
full definition of the support field? Like, what does support core mean, and what are the other things that could be put in that field?
So that is in the concept doc. Core means that it is 100% portable. So for example, the current Ingress v1 is supposed to be 100% portable. Extended means that if you support it, then it will behave as if it will behave portably, saying that you are supporting it. You know, modulo like bugs or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I assumed. I don't see it in the concept docs, in the concept stock though.
Oh, really?
we did have it a while ago.
I thought it's in there. Okay. Oh, that's surprising. Let me see. Concepts. Core. Ah. How to contribute. Did we never add it?
File an issue. We're missing support
crap.
details.
I'll take the action to file the issue.
What? How did this never end up? Oh, okay. Somehow it never ended up in there.
Or it got removed.
Yeah, and I want to say here recently, Bowie, I looked at one of the presentations you did where it showed kind of the gravitational pull of to core. It'd be nice to have, I don't know, maybe have that diagram and talk a little bit about what you had in the slide into the concept stock.
It is completely missing. So, okay, this is my bad. I just assumed it was in here. Okay, I will. Yeah, James, if you file it, then please assign it to me. This is a little embarrassing. I thought it was like totally in here.
Yeah, I thought it was there too. So that's fine.
All right, James, promise not to put anything on the mailer that's missing. And
cool.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, Harry, that's a good point. Given sort of we're factoring service around, there's no like very nice place for it to live. I do want to kind of preserve that thought, just because from our experience, like the weird thing about Kubernetes service is it's not a service in how most people think of like a deployment or application,
Right.
and yet it's like it sort of is.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, the timeout is like tied to a service because usually that's the same deployment will have the same characteristics, and setting them independently is a little bit strange.
Yeah, so right now the way Kong works around it is we set like this is annotation. So if you have to set out timeouts, you set an annotation on the service instead of ingress. But so that's one point. I don't know, how do we record this? Like, should we open a GitHub issue or?
Yeah, maybe we should, let's, it's a toughie. Let's open a GitHub issue on service APIs.
Okay.
For example, the other things that come to mind are client TLS settings and things like that that seem like they are actually part of a service instead of on the route to. And then sort of put some evaluation there, because it feels like a lot of these are going to be in that bucket where you're basically the thing that you're describing is that deployment in that service. And if we kind of like just spread it everywhere, that may end up being a worse, it just like would be bad for everyone, because then people would have to, for every service, comma, different set of configuration, like do something. It kind of like explodes the number of things that you have to handle.
When you say service in this context, do you mean network application or Kubernetes service object?
Probably both, but
Yeah.
the best analog would be a Kubernetes service object. Is that
Yeah, that's accurate. Like that, I mean, that's the most accurate I think we can present today.
yeah, it's like a little bit weird how Kubernetes has decoupled the two. Like a lot of people will talk about service, they'll talk about application, which comes with a service. And then when we talk about Kubernetes API, the only thing we can really point to is the service. But yeah, and then these attributes are sort of like attributes of a given application or deployment or
Right,
config.
because there's like 3 levels that you can put a timeout on, right? You can put it on the client-facing application side, you can put it on the next hop proxy side, or then you can put it on the kind of target backend side.
What is the third one, James?
Put it on the service object itself, and say anything that refers to, so everything that refers to me should have this timeout, should look at this timeout. Or you could put it on, as you have here on the route, which says, oh, for this proxy client talking to this talking to this backend, this is the timeout that I should use.
I think, like, at least I know Nginx config a little bit better, is that you configure an upstream pool and you define properties there, which means if you pushed it down to like this path and this and this and this has this set of timeout, like you'd have to create different pools for each different combination of config, which probably is not super great.
And that's how most people get around to it. So that's like the root of the problem that, and the reason I commented, like I'm bringing this up, is because you have to create different upstream pools. What is one service? A proxy treats as 5 services. There are 5 routes pointing to that one service, right? And which is probably not operationally correct if you do have a problem and you start digging into that. And I think most implementations of even Ingress V1 do that, because we want, so each service is not one service inside, let's say, Nginx Ingress. It's like 4 services if you have 4 routes. So 4 upstream pools, which sort of defeats the point of having that abstraction.
Okay, yeah. So if there's, it sounds like there's a lot more commonality. I also remember HA proxy. Yeah, so like it seems like a common issue, and we should definitely file an issue and talk about how to represent it. Because if everyone is end up having to do this like multiplicative like blowout to all the different combinations, that seems less great. Also, it does have an issue with respect to if you're doing metrics per pool, then they get all strange because they're all aliases of each other, and you'd have to like aggregate them again.
Right. Yes. So let me at least jot these thoughts down, what we have discussed in an issue, and then we can see what we can do inside the service and what we can do here. But for the time being, should we move forward with this, or?
I think given that, then we should sort of put on hold for now. I think the different attributes, like should it have a timeout, should it have a retry, like those are things that we can just discuss and try to evaluate, because that is sort of like independent of where it gets attached. I think the real big question is like, does it get attached here specifically under like a match rule, or does it get attached sort of in aggregate across a destination service? The latter seems to have matched much better with the conceptual models of several proxies that I know of, but I don't know all of them. So it'd be good to hear like how other people have been, translating these.
Sounds good.
Harry, when you create that issue, can you link it to this PR?
Sure thing.
Thanks.
And while we are at this PR, I think one thing that at least Nginx doesn't support is probably the interval field inside the retry policy struct. That's probably inside the file view. Yeah. So I don't think there is a way. Maybe with like Lua, you could do something like that in Nginx, but this is essentially adding in some jitter or something like that to avoid thundering boots. So that's not probably supported by Nginx.
Good to know. All right, well, thank you. Yeah, it sounds like we have good follow-ups on this one. Let's move on, because I know there's been lots of other discussion here on different pull requests and issues. Are there any, I know there's a big pull request from James that I'd like to talk about at some point today. Are there any smaller ones that we should cover first? Anything that really, I know there's a few LGTMs that are ready to go and just need an approve. I think these are all non-controversial and good.
Yeah, that
So
top one
probably
is super easy and is actually fixing a bug.
Yeah. And so beyond that, are there any issues or PRs that, well, actually, I thought this was interesting. It probably deserves some broader discussion. So maybe James, if you want to just discuss the high level you're aiming towards here.
Sure, I can talk about this. If you go back to the conversation, there's a doc there where I draw a diagram of kind of what happens and how things look when you try to provision a TLS service. And I think I felt like this was kind of I was quite pleased with myself with this, because I thought, oh, this is a way to specify kind of what I felt was kind of clearly about what I felt was like a little bit of a problem that we've been struggling with for a while. And I think the root problem is that there is this thing people think about, and it's my application, right? And I want to expose my application. So we have a cluster operator who owns the gateway and the secrets. It owns the gateway stuff. And then that's decoupled from the application owner's object by the routes selector. But this concept of an application kind of crosses both roles. So you have one object or one part of your thing, that part of your application that exists kind of in the world in people's internal models, and it's split across these two roles. And that's, I think, is where, and the fact that you take one thing and you smear it across and you both try to manage the same thing is what creates kind of the awkwardness around this model. And it's kind of, I think it's the root cause of why we've struggled with TLS and the gateway relationship for so long. So taking that, if that's our problem definition, then okay, so the obvious next step is to say, oh well, let's take these two parts and stick them in and see what happens if we put them together, and what does that look like? So I had this concept. So I said, okay, this is like basically the concept here is a logical endpoint. Nick and I talked about it for a bit. Nick was like, oh, well, that's basically a listener. So I went from trying to have a separate endpoint concept to saying, okay, let's fold this into listener and say, instead of listener, and say, well, listener is now firmly on the side of being a logical endpoint, right? So logical endpoint means it's that there is a process that can accept some sort of client request on that.
Oh, by the way, Rob or James, is there something we should be looking at? Because we're just looking at your diagram.
Oh, sorry. So Rob, can you flip back to the code diff? Thanks, Rob. So now, if you scroll down to listener, let's just close the comments on that so we can see more on the screen. If you go to
I don't
the
even
three
know
dots,
how to close comments, but
if you go to the 3 dots next to viewed.
oh
there's
yeah, thank you.
comments. Okay, so now what we have is that addresses, the address is a direct field in the gateway spec, and all the other attributes are in the listener. So the listener has a host name, a port, it has, if you keep going down, it has the protocol, and it has the TLS. So, and it has the routes. So all these things which are logically required to create, to expose an application through a gateway, are now in the same struct. So they're always logically, these things are always logically together. So now they're sort of together in the API structure as well. So I think putting them together, putting things that are needed, that are used together, that are logically together, physically together, kind of makes the API easier to reason about and easier to describe.
So, Rob, can you
Go
scroll
ahead.
up?
So you can scroll up to see the changes in Gateway.
So it's not that listener is not a resource. It's just you
Correct.
moved the
Correct.
routes into the listeners. I see.
Yep. So basically what this is doing is saying things which you need to use as a unit are now expressed directly as a unit. Right? So you have listeners, which are endpoints that expose your application, and then you have addresses, which are where which is the the IP address on your gateway. So when you want to, so all the listeners are exposed on all the addresses on a gateway. If you need to vary that relationship, then you would create multiple gateways.
I see. And this makes it a little bit more complicated from the simplest use case, but it does actually allow you to have different behavior for 443 than 80. So that was one of the issues with the previous model, is if you wanted 80 to redirect to 443, there was no out of the box obvious way to do it, but you could have a different route.
So when you say the simplest model, can you what are you thinking of there?
I'm just thinking of like the like the tiniest YAML to get things off the ground.
So
like let's say
like
actually
like a HTTP proxy.
Yeah,
like
but you know what? Since
HTTP
route is indirected, you don't have that much duplication. So one of the things that we were sort of like, for example, the SDO API had like a lot of duplication because you need to kind of duplicate things between the two protocols. But since we can just reference the route, it won't be too bad here, I don't think.
So in this model, to expose a HTTP service over port 80, you would set a single listener, which would have a host name, port 80. So port is required now because port is either implicit based on the protocol or it's required. So it's just simpler to say required. So you would set host name to your host name, port to 80, protocol to HTTP, and if you scroll down a little bit more, Rob, you would set the routes to your route selector. So
Yeah,
I
this
think it's
not
pretty.
bad.
So I think it's pretty. I think the end result of that YAML is pretty similar to what you had before, but I'd argue that it's I'd argue that the intent is clearer and that it's easier for implementers to kind of explain the rules about how things work.
Yeah, this is a good idea, I think. I have to think about it, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah, overall, this is definitely much better than what we had before. Can you explain how TLS config would look like in this case a little bit? I don't know if you've thought about that, James.
Yeah, so I think one of the things this does is it ties the TLS config directly into the logical listener, because my argument is that it's part of the object that exposes and defines the application. So I haven't changed the TLS config here at all, but what I expect is that the way you'd expose a HTTPS service is you would set the host name, you would set the protocol type, you would set the port to your SNI name, HTTPS, and 443, and then you would provide a TLS config. And because you have a single struct with all the same fields, it's easy to write what the validation rules are. It's one of the things that's a little bit weird is that the required fields here depend on the protocol. So you could write a table that says, well, if the protocol is TLS, you need these ones. If the protocol is HTTP, you need these different ones. The protocol. So that's a little uncomfortable because it's basically, I mean, you really it's really a union type. It's really like a crappy union type that you have here.
Well, you could talk to the Go authors about that one.
Yeah.
Uh,
So if you scroll up, Rob, one of the things Rob pointed out when he commented the review is that I'm pinning the set of protocols to a specific protocol type here. So I'm saying these are the protocol types. Like previously, protocol type was a string with the implication that it can be anything you want. I'm kind of pulling that back. I'm saying, look, in practice, it can't be anything you want. It can be one of these things. And one of the benefits of, I think, saying that of kind of nailing these things down is that it lets you explain what implementations should do with them. So you can see that right down the bottom of the section Rob's showing here is we can now say explicitly, okay, the gateway can collapse multiple listeners into something that accepts, into a single connection accepting thing. I'm trying very hard not to reuse the word listener. And we can say what makes them compatible. Like we can say the circumstances under which you can do that. So this is how you define how SNI works. So if you have listeners if you have a listener which is HTTPS, has a host name, now you can do SNI, and if the port matches 2, then okay, I can put all these listeners on the same port and discriminate using SNI. But as soon as you start trying to say that how you can define multiple applications on the same port, at that point you're moving into a world that's protocol specific. So my argument in this PR is like, okay, let's just accept that, go to a protocol specific way, and accept that it's going to be limited, but and then take the benefit of being able to kind of express things in a very concrete way within those limitations.
Yeah, this is interesting. The one example that is a little bit wacky potentially is, for example, if you have gRPC, which is over HTTP2. So
Yep.
we can probably make it work. I just like, how would you handle that in this situation? Or is it just HTTP2 here?
I don't have my camera on, but I'm kind of wildly waving my hands in the air. Yeah, so I guess there's a number of ways you could do that. You could either say, okay, there's a new protocol type, and then and then kind of work through what that means. What I've sort of assumed here is that HTTPS is any old crap over HTTPS. There's no way in this model today, in this PR, to publish the alternate protocols over in the TLS handshake. So that's kind of wacky. It also seems like for gRPC specifically, you might end up with a different route type or different routes.
Yeah.
The route selector that goes to a different type. And I pointed that in one of the comments that Rob made. I didn't make it explicit in this PR, but I think that the protocol and the type of the routes are actually tightly coupled. So we haven't represented that in the model before, and we don't really represent it here. But I think in practice, when you say the protocol type is HTTP or the protocol type is gRPC, then that sort of implies or requires, some kind of restrictions on what type of resources the route selector is able to select.
Yeah, like the gRPC is an interesting one since it exists on top of HTTP2, and you can run them concurrently. I don't know if many people do it, but you can run them concurrently on the same port, I think.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can do that. Yeah,
I added
So-
do that.
Some years ago, I added an API to Traffic Server, which lets you write a plugin which listens on a protocol name, right? So you can do crazy stuff with that.
Yeah, so this looks very interesting. That is my example of like an odd duck that we could see how we would fit it in here somehow, or would it fit, or like do we need to add like a small stuff to add to make it work, or like would it just not work? But
I
this
think it
looks
would
pretty interesting.
fit. Like I think you could. You could just say, look, you could just add a gRPC protocol type, right? If you added a gRPC protocol type, that would fit in the model, and then you'd have to answer the question of, okay, what happens to the route? What kind of routes should my route selector do? Do I need any extra fields in the listener to kind of handle that?
Yeah, so with the gRPC, it would use the same port as 443 if you want it to be strange, and then
Let's talk about a more simpler example where we have TLS and HTTPS here. So, right, we have TLS and HTTPS as two protocols. And
Yep.
let's say we expose a TLS route on 443, sorry, an HTTPS route on 443. Now, are we allowed to expose TLS on 443, or because
Yes.
now you are?
Yes, we
okay.
are. So if you, Rob, would you mind scrolling up a bit, Rob? So just above the listener. Okay. Yep. Thank you. That's perfect. So we have this notion of collapsing listeners into some implementation defined proxy construct. And so because the listener is now this really explicit thing, we can kind of tease out the rules for that. So we can say that we'll collapse what we call compatible listeners, and listeners are compatible if in this case HTTPS or TLS is specified, the host name is specified, and the port field matches. So we can say, okay, TLS, and you have two listeners, one is HTTPS, one is TLS. They both have different host names, both on the same port. Okay, you can compile that down to an SNI matcher.
Yeah,
This
but
sentence here is actually ambiguous because HTTP and HTTPS are obviously not considered compatible.
so like
but in that case, most proxies probably don't support it. Like most proxies can either do, like, if you take a port and do HTTP, they will just stick to HTTP. And then if you ask those proxies to, not most, at least I know of, at least Nginx and I think HA proxy cannot do that. Like you can either have an HTTP port, or you can either have just byte stream or TCP TLS port.
yeah, like probably not all combinations can work. Like I think it would be really strange to have TLS and HTTPS and they have the same port? Because
No, that seems perfectly fine because that's TLS pass-through, right?
I think TLS pass-through would be modeled with TCP and then an
Yeah.
SNI match
Yeah.
in the route.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, there's kind of two. I guess there's two kinds of pass-through. At least in Contour, there's two kinds. There's pass-through where you're just passing through the byte stream after a
Termination.
after a SNI match, and then there's the termination as well. So yeah, there's actually two cases there. You're right.
Yeah, the terminating one seems like that would be incompatible with HTTPS, but the non-terminating one as well. Well, I guess you can make it work. It's just a little bit grungy.
So I think they're logically compatible. I mean, you can do TLS and HTTPS on the same port and discriminate by host name to decide what to do with those things.
Yeah. So logically, I think theoretically they make sense, but practically, I'm not sure how many. But I think we are like really digging into one specific part. I think we can still make this like write a doc up to figure out like what are compatible or not, and then if we document that, I think this will be compatible with most implementations out there. So
yeah,
this looks,
practically, I know we can do this in Envoy. I'm pretty sure we can't do it in Traffic Server, and I'm not sure about the other proxies.
yeah, Nginx cannot do it either. Like I have spent like
you just need to send a PR, James.
Yeah, that'll be our responsibility as the working group, is to like modify all the proxies to meet our model.
No, this is very interesting. It is very interesting. So I think everyone should kind of look over this, and then it's pretty promising actually.
Yeah, one another comment that I have is the host name that we have inside the listener field. I have not looked at this PR, so this is more of a knee-jerk reaction, but it's more of like having a filter rather than being like strict about it, because now if you're having a new route with a different domain, you have to add that to the gateway as well. So
yeah, it's like,
so there's a part which we haven't shown here. It's pulled out. So there's Rob, could you flip to the route, the HTTP route types file? So there's no host name in the HTTP route types anymore. So that's nuked. So the route host is only the routes. So in terms of the diagram in the Google Doc, everything that exposes an application through a gateway is now the responsibility of the cluster operator, and everything else, and on the other side of that is now the responsibility of the application owner. So that's the boundary at which we decouple. So that's not necessarily a boundary that's going to work for all use cases, right? Because now you say, well, okay, well, the cluster operator is now responsible for more stuff than I really want. But given that our argument initially was that the problem, given our problem definition of the problem is that this thing is split across the two domains, then okay, we've chosen a domain. We've chosen the cluster operator gets to own this thing.
Yeah, this is a change. So I'm wondering if we go back to our use cases, which ones become less possible?
Yep. There's definitely some impact on the set of use cases.
Yeah, to go back to this model as an example, you've basically pulled the host out to, well, gateway listener, and so the domain of cluster operator, and removed it from the app owner, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this box that's application is now fully under the control or in the domain of the cluster operator, rather than being this shared.
Don't you still need the hosts in the HTTP route? Because if you had a list of host names or like a wildcard, don't you need to still match on that?
But the matching is specified in the listener. But the host name field in the listener specifies the match.
Like, let's say you had like star.wordpress.com, and then you put the like foo.wordpress.com as a route and bar.wordpress.com as a route. Don't you still need a host there?
That and plus now, let's say you have two listeners, and one is for bar.wordpress.com, another for foo.wordpress.com, and now you have to figure out the right labels to use to bind to the correct listener, right? Because if you scroll down, Rob, again, you have the route selector at the listener level, right? I think, yeah. So now you'll have to correctly label the routes, otherwise you will connect your route to the wrong domain, which seems like a little clunky.
Yeah, so if you had a lot, basically the concept here is that you would have a listener per domain. So you could end up with you would end up with a lot of listeners potentially if you had a large number of host names. I honestly haven't really thought about wildcards at all. So the use case of taking a wildcard and then filtering those host names at the HTTP route layer.
That seems like,
I hadn't thought about that.
yeah, it's not an unusual request if you, for example, like star.myinternalapps. Whatever, and then you allow all the app people to kind of get registered in there.
Like Knative does this a lot because every Knative function, they call it, I don't know what is the technical term, but that's exposed at a different subdomain. But I think we can still work this out. This is still pretty promising and a much better, like it's a big improvement over what we had previously.
Yeah, I
We have the
agree. I like this
example.
direction.
We have
Go
the
ahead.
example. We have the example. What is it? Example HTTP app or something like that, or basic HTTP.yaml. It'd be nice to maybe see how a few examples for the few common use cases we're trying to solve. What would an example manifest look like with this model?
Yeah, that's oh, is it there? Oh no, this is the existing stuff.
Yeah, it's existing, but to be able to
Yeah, I haven't added any examples, but I agree with Daniel. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, so this looks promising. I will definitely comment and go through some of the examples.
Yeah, I think the wildcard part seems hard on this model. You would definitely you could definitely use like a wildcard certificate and share that. But it's hard to see a way around having to add a new listener for every host name that you want to expose.
The other thing is, I don't know if you can remove host name matching from the route.
But it's moot, so you're not removing it. It's just that you've done the host name matching before you get to the route.
But don't you need to, like, let's say your route, IC, so you're guaranteed that's like only one host name?
Yeah,
but not with a wildcard.
Yeah, you're guaranteed this one-to-one relationship between the host name and the route selector.
And James, did you consider like doing rather like a filtering of host name on a specific listener rather than matching? So let's say you do a star.example.com, but then the route still specifies the host which is used for matching, right? And then
yeah, that's what I was thinking as well.
Yeah, if you put a wildcard in the host name, I suppose you could do that. You'd need to retain the host name in the HTTP route host, which I'd always thought about the route host as the host name field in route host as kind of an upward configuration. So it's like a configuration that you're taking from the route and pushing up into the gateway. I hadn't really considered it in terms of it coming down, in terms of it, okay, it's coming down and being just part of the match.
Okay, I think let's comment on this. Well, this definitely is pretty interesting.
If you keep the hostname in both places, then I mean that would let you write rules around it. I'm not sure if it's necessary.
I think like what additional things are you doing with the host name at the listener level? Are you validating the certificate, or like what is,
well, at the listener level,
aside from matching?
Yeah, at the listener level, it's purely there for to rationalize the TLS and SNI stuff, right?
I see. So you have to explicitly put it there, and then in your certificate bundle, you'll be checking to see that that is valid, something like that.
Because you know what the host name is, and you know the certificate, you know then that this is the certificate bundle that belongs to the host name. So when you get an SNI request for a host name, you know exactly what certificate bundle to use without needing any additional rules.
I see. Okay, so that's the part that is being used for the proxy config. So yeah, I think let's all just think about it and then post comments and then discuss it further. I have a good understanding of the model now.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying this is the way we should go, but it's kind of what falls, if you think that, if you agree with the problem statement, then this is kind of one of the things that sort of falls out of trying to address that.
Yeah, I think the other, where the host name is, I think is an interesting one. The other one is, given some of the conversations, we've been also thinking about how L4 would work. So, and I know some folks, they're not on the call today. Is that right?
No, they're not, but
yeah. So that would also be an interesting exercise to run through this rearrangement. And then I think we should explicitly say that SNI sniffing bypass should just be TCP protocol, or UDP, I guess, if you use DTLS, because that one resolves a lot of some of the ambiguities about like where it lives.
I agree.
Right. So
okay,
if you
let
don't
me
want
take
that,
a note.
if you don't want to match, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and even the L4 routing stuff is much better in this one because the route selector listener is not at the gateway layer anymore. It's at the listener level, right? If somebody defines an L4 route, they can actually even specify which listener to bind to.
Yeah, I think that L4 stuff is fairly straightforward here because you can have TCP or TLS as your protocol, and you just specify the protocol on the port and the route selector, and then it seems kind of like a one-to-one match.
Yeah, for at least for TCP it would be just one-to-one, one listener to one route, and for TLS it could be one-to-many. So that seems pretty usable.
Okay, does someone want to, I'll try to write up some of the L4 examples and we can just to document them.
I'll reach out to
Rob, you want
Jeremy.
to do it?
I talked to him already today because they're planning on presenting about a plan for L4 tomorrow morning for the main meeting.
Okay.
And this is one of the things I talked to him specifically about, or that came up, was the idea that we probably wanted the route selector to be aware of protocol. So instead of it selecting every kind of route that matched that, it could select a specific kind of route. So there seems to be some good overlap here with what they were already thinking about.
Okay, yeah. Hey, Rob, if you're going to do the legwork,
Yeah,
that would be good.
cool.
You pointed him at this?
Not yet, not yet. This is
Okay.
this came out shortly. I don't know, but yeah, talking it through now, it seems like there's some good overlap here. So good news all around.
Okay, cool.
All right. Well,
Anything?
yeah, thank you. We only have a few minutes left, but are there any quick PRs that could use a bit of attention here?
I'm going to use, if not, I'm going to use the extra time to go through these. I haven't
Okay.
had time recently, so.
Okay. That works. I think maybe we should call it then, because we've had great discussions all around, and
Can I just
we'll
make,
give you some. Oh,
can I
go
just make
ahead.
one announcement? It's not really an
Yeah.
announcement. I know Nick raised this on the Slack channel. We chatted and we thought it might be an interesting exercise for everyone who has an ingress controller and is involved in the working group to just walk the other members of the working group through how to set up a HTTPS site or microservice using their ingress controller. Just thought it'd be a fun exercise to say, okay, what are the different approaches everyone's taking, and just get everyone to see what we're all doing there.
Using the old API or the new API?
Using the existing native API of their controller. So if you're doing ingress, or if you have your custom way, or whatever you do natively today.
Okay, put it on the agenda. We can throw it out there. People probably need a little bit of time, but it sounds fun.
In addition to the agenda, it would be nice to actually capture that somewhere. So maybe if it's in addition to or in replacement of, actually presenting it as actually just, you know, a simple document that shows step one, this is what you do, step two, and voila.
Yeah, that could be good too.
Yeah, I was going to say put it on the agenda so we can just repeat it so that people can participate. When we,
I think as we
tomorrow.
go along this journey, it might be nice to be able to go back and have, you know, like one point where it's like, hey, what does this look like for all the different implementations out there today? So I guess just making sure we capture it somewhere.
Cool. You know, one other bit of follow up while I'm thinking about it. I know the end of the last meeting we had, we were discussing traffic splitting, and multi-cluster use cases came up. That definitely has not been forgotten. I've been working on a doc, talking with some multi-cluster folks and others about how the two can interact. And I think, and I hope I can have this doc ready to share by tomorrow, but I think that minimal to no changes are required to the existing traffic splitting plan we have. So I think what Danian had already proposed should work well with multi-cluster use cases. But just trying to get final confirmation on that.
Cool. Yeah, I've actually spent quite a bit of time diving into the public doc that I'm not sure if other people have seen. If not, let me just pop this in the chat window really quick.
Oh yeah.
This is it, and it actually links to the CAT. I'm still trying to rationalize the need for some of these new resources like the service import and export.
Yeah.
And I've been having some conversations with Jeremy Olmsted Thompson.
Yeah. He's been leading the efforts toward multi-cluster services, and he's also going to be one of the people presenting on L4 tomorrow.
Cool.
So yeah, he's been involved here too. But yeah, it seems like like you say, we may not even need to reference service export directly. We may, as far as traffic splitting, even in a multi-cluster use case, we may be able to reference the service object itself, but that's less clear. But our model allows for referencing either, and so it's great. But yeah, okay. Well, I think that's all we had for today. Any last thoughts, comments? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see all of you tomorrow.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.